I was asked by Giovanni to speak about protection of privacy in genomics research, and this is something that I've thought a lot about across the sort of two disciplines that I work across, which is bioethics and social studies of science. I'm currently at basically the Institute of Philosophy in Madrid in the Science, Technology and Society department. And as of January, I moved to Edinburgh, and I'll be working on a project called the construction of risk in genomics. So that's just to tell you a bit about kind of where I am at the moment. Listening to the other talks in the last couple of days, I've learned a lot in relation to kind of my work and how it relates to the kind of discourse of openness that is across the sciences, because of being in this field, working on privacy, looking at human data, it's true that you become very focused on the human data, the issues around human data. And I think that there might be, as I listen to other presentations, I think that it's kind of becoming clear to me, but I'm not so sure it's very helpful for us to think about human data in the same way as we think about data, as Jenny said, from the rest of science. So that's a thesis that's kind of been developing in my head the last couple of days, and maybe we can talk about it at the end of the presentation. Okay, so the structure of the talk. So I'm going to focus on data. This is how I've generally thought about privacy, because obviously there's more philosophical aspects of privacy and what privacy is, the right to be let alone, the right to control access to a certain sphere of life. So there are all these kind of deep philosophical arguments which I've covered in the past, but I'm not going to cover today. I'm going to focus on some issues that I've thought about in relation to research data in general, and to tell you how I came into this. I did my PhD at the University of Manchester in a statistics department, where I was looking at confidentiality and privacy in relation to statistical data. And one of the things that hit me very quickly is how the law differentiates between personal data, and I'm going to talk quite a bit about this, personal data and anonymized data. So at the beginning of my PhD, a while ago now, I kind of thought, well, actually there's nothing to say about this, because that's it. There are no privacy issues, right? Because the data is anonymized. Only personal data can have privacy issues. But as I realized, this is not the case, actually. With statistical data, there are issues that relate to privacy, and they're quite complicated, and I'm going to try to get into them a bit today with you. So I'll talk a lot about identity and anonymity. The next one I want to talk about is consent and context. It's very difficult to think about how privacy is protected in relation to data in the research sphere without thinking about consent. Consent is crucial to research. And some time ago, I've been working on a project looking at repositories of data, biobanks. And I was thinking about how this often changes very much the context that people give their data in. So people might enter a research project within a very small setting, within a clinic even. That's very common in genetics, where people have a relationship with a doctor, a medic, and they give their data in that setting. But then when it goes to a repository, a biobank, that context is different. So that's sort of where it made me think about, well, you know, what is consent doing there? Can this kind of thing be thought about in advance? What do people understand about what they're doing? And what can the researchers do to protect data and continue this relationship that started with the data being handed over, perhaps in a clinic, perhaps in a cohort study, when it goes to a different context. And I'm going to touch upon open access and how this has kind of come along, this kind of idea of open access. Not only I realise in relation to human genomic data, but in relation more data. But my focus is on how the open access discourse interacts with human data and some of the ethical, social issues I want to talk about. And I couldn't resist just mentioning big data. And I mean, I think big data can be a very helpful concept because, well, what is big data? Well, I very much see it as the processes of the different interactions that happen and how they're multiplied to the huge amounts of different combinations that data can get into. And obviously there's this idea of an increase in the velocity, the volume, and the variety, so the 3 V's, which I think is undeniably the case. Okay, so on to identity and privacy and data. So what we have been working with for a long time in relation to research data, not only genomic data, but data and statistics and data coming from the census and surveys, is a model which relies upon the consent of one person. So a person enters into a relationship where they give their data and they are usually promised confidentiality. So we can already start to see how different this is from other types of data, because when you collect other types of data, this relationship is not there between the person who, the thing, the entity that the data is about. We can talk about the researchers and what they do, but the thing that the data relates to is very different when it's a human, because the human is expected to have autonomy and be able to say, look, I know what I'm doing, I'm giving you this, and in return, they usually the identifiability is usually removed, so they're no longer known as that person, but they become a number or whatever, and that's kind of the deal. That's the kind of contract underlying research. But what I want to think about is, what is it to be non-identifiable? And this is the question I'm kind of opening that I want you to kind of think about during the presentation. When you give your data and you hope that that's the end, most people think, okay, I've given the data, I've been told that it's for X, Y, Z purpose, and that is the end for me. I'm not going to be identifiable. This is not going to be something that is going to come back to haunt me. But I want to think about, well, is this actually, is this kind of complete divorce from the kind of identity? Is this happening at the moment? And I will argue that not necessarily. One of the issues that I'll talk about is the problem of inference, probabilities, and how they're attached to people. And the issue of profiles, which I'll talk about a lot, in which a mixture of kind of statistical, probabilistic data is attached to a person. So it's not necessarily the case that just because a certain amount of data that's kind of applied to you as a member of a population doesn't have your name on it, that it won't at some level be able to be interpreted to say something about your identity and who you are, and what you like and what you do. We all know about the sort of profiles that are used in kind of marketing and these sorts of things. So I want us to think a bit about what are the potential consequences of this for these tenets, these foundations of the relationship of the research subject to research. To this idea that we can have a research environment while also maintaining individual privacy and confidentiality. What does it mean for informed consent? What do we tell a person that to expect now? How do we inform expectations about the implications, the consequences of giving data when, as I'll talk about, things are changing so fast in the wider environment? interesting to me. I mean, as I say, the privacy literature is vast and it's growing all the time. I'm not going to go into this. I'm really going to think very much about data and the kinds of things that inform the way I think about data in relation to privacy. So this is actually my supervisor was Angela Dale, and she's a very important person in relation to kind of statistical data in the UK. And a long time ago, they worked very closely with the Office for National Statistics, which obviously is a big organisation that releases a lot of research data. It's very important. They came up with this concept of the data intruder in order to kind of simplify the scenario in which the process of anonymisation, in which the promise of confidentiality, if you like, could be undermined, so that the data intruder is the person that would have a motivation to try to reverse the anonymity of data. So they thought about a set of potential scenarios. So they wanted to undermine the government, they wanted to find out about their friends, about what they were doing, something like this. So this is a very kind of, it's a very simplistic idea of the problem of anonymisation. Later on, another problem which came up in the statistical disclosure control field was the problem of multiple data sources. And Sweeney, on her own, had written earlier about the data explosion and a kind of change in the culture of how people think about data. So there's this kind of data hunger. So you don't necessarily collect data because you want to answer a specific question. You collect data because it might one day be useful to somebody for something. So this was a shift that Sweeney had identified kind of towards the end of the 90s with relation to human data. And Mallon and Sweeney then later on talked about the difficulty then that this poses when you have multiple data sources out there, because of the potential to compare data sets and to work things out. It's not just from one isolated data set, which yes, would probably be extremely difficult, but when you have the possibility to compare data sets on the same population, so you have, for example, records about the postcodes of people, then you have the kind of consumer behaviour, and then you have the kind of incomes that they have in that area. So, you know, bit by bit, given the different sorts of data sets and potentially knowledge about a particular person, you might be able to join the data sets up and find out things about a person that, by inference across data sets, by thinking, right, that probably applies to that person because this other characteristic applies to that person. So, to try to think about all of these data sets that are out there and the potential overlaps and the potential for doing those sorts of kind of cross-comparisons, and I'm going to give you, don't worry, I'm going to give you a specific example in relation to genomics in a second. But Elliot et al., and these are Elliot and Dana from the same, my old department basically in Manchester University, work a lot with the Office for National Statistics, and work a lot on data protection and in relation to this kind of data, research data. So he talked about the data environment, and while it was in some ways quite a conservative idea of the data environment, it was for me a kind of a revolutionary step for disclosure control, because it was saying, look, we simply cannot think about disclosure in relation to one data set. We've got to think that there's a data environment out there with some populations covered to a great extent, and the information about those populations available to everybody or available to quite a lot of people, or these sorts of things. You have to think about those sorts of issues. You have to think about those complexities. So to me that was really a breakthrough in how we think about the data that's out there and how, in effect, how it comes back to this issue of anonymity and confidentiality and identifiability. Okay, so there's been a lot of kind of work done in sociology information, and the most recent thing that I've been reading is about liquid surveillance. This is by Bowman and Lyon. And Lyon has on his own actually worked a lot on the idea of social sorting. So the fact that there's a lot of information out there that can be used not necessarily to kind of reverse anonymization, but rather to say, okay, this is this type of, that person with, you know, a name Catherine Heeney is this type of person, they fall into this kind of category. So we'll use this information to sort the population out and put people in different groups. He called it social sorting. Now, with liquid surveillance, it's kind of a jump again, and it's very much kind of starting to tap into the fears around big data. That there are just so many different combinations of data that are possible that we've really lost control. We have lost control of our data, but other people with the kind of the means to process data have not lost control of our data. They're not necessarily saying that there's a kind of a big brother figure out there that's doing this in a very sort of malevolent way. What they're saying is people have got lots of motivations for wanting data about different individuals. So, you know, you've got your very benevolent kind of ideas of, you know, public health and controlling the spread of disease, or trying to tackle early the kind of onset of disease in particular populations, or giving those people information. You've also got the other end, kind of marketing. You've got insurance, that means you don't want to insure people with particular types of problems. But the problem is that the kind of combinations and how the data is moving is really liquid. So it's not something that you can kind of close up and control or even really understand. It's a very difficult problem. It's a very difficult thing for any individual to visualize where their data is and who's got it. So this is kind of the idea of liquid surveillance. And what they say is, rather than thinking of the big brother metaphor, which is often being used for privacy, what we should think about is the trial by Franz Kafka, where actually you're being affected by pieces of information about you, but you're not really sure how this has come to pass or what the consequences will be. You know that somebody has this sort of information about you, but you're not really sure how or what will happen as a result. So another set of literature that's been very important has been from law and philosophy, and it's a pity that Jens has gone, because Anton Weber is at Tilburg, and I came across him when I was a Marie Curie fellow in Tilburg, and he has a very interesting concept which is categorical privacy. So what he argues is that because profiles which are built up from statistical data and a combination of data can be applied to individuals, those individuals then put into categories, and they lose control of some of the rights that privacy would normally give to them. So this is the problem of categorical privacy. So when you're put into a category, you then lose some of your autonomy. That's the basic idea really behind categorical privacy. Because decisions are being made about you. You can't control them legally because they're not entirely made using personal data. But they're nevertheless about you and affect you. Contextual integrity I'm going to talk a lot more about, because I think the context is very important to the data subject, because it is, and there's been lots of work by a very eminent bioethicist called Honore Neal, who's written about the fact that people don't often read the consent form. What they tend to do is think about the context that they're giving the data in. So when you're in a particular context, you kind of have an understanding of what will probably happen when you give data in that context. And I'm going to give some examples. And then in 2012, I wrote about how, you know, this issue of group profiling and identity and personal data is still really to be addressed legally. Okay, now, this is just really to tell you that there are movements on the legal front here. So this is legislation, proposed legislation at an EU level relating to personal data, anonymised data. Now, the Directive 94/46/EC is kind of the directive in relation to personal data. And they kind of reiterate here this classic and all-important definition of personal data. Why is it all important? Well, it's all important because personal data is something that is very much thought and understood to belong to a person. A person should have control over that data. Whereas data which is anonymous is not thought, hasn't traditionally been thought to affect a person. So for a researcher, for people doing research for research organisations, this is crucial because whereas you can't pass on personal data to third parties, it's absolutely understood that you will pass on statistical research data. That is the whole point, where other people will use this statistical data. And that is why this dichotomy is so important. Okay. So, coming back to genomics, I'm just going to talk a bit about some of the work that happened a few years ago now. But it was kind of catastrophic, really, for people's understanding of how they could deal with data from the genomic field. So there's been this understanding, which I've been talking about, that non-identifiable data is no longer a problem. Homer and his colleagues, via the cross-comparison of two different data sets, were able to pull out the identity of a person. So from these, like they had data sets with names, and then they had a different data set with DNA in it. And through iterative cross-comparison between these two data sets, they were able to untangle the DNA and work out that a person would have been at a crime scene. So this is what this paper was about. And this was the point of this paper was to say, when you've got a messy crime scene that's full of blood and other types of bodily fluid from persons, it previously been thought that you couldn't necessarily prove that one person had been there because of the overlap and the mess. But what they wanted to say was you can untangle this mess by this iterative comparison. This had earth-shattering consequences because it meant that you could de-anonymise genomic data even if you had another reference data set. This led to the Wellcome Trust pulling data that had been available on the web, off the web. So that was the first thing. Then, in a sort of a flurry of this type of work, Gitcher did work on, again, two different data sets. And this is very important that there are more than one data set being used. That's a very important point. You can't do this with just one data set. But what she found is there was a genomic data set out there about Y chromosomes of the population of Latter-day Saints living in Utah. And she, there was the HapMap project with the Y chromosome information about men living in Utah, And then there was another data set with surnames and information about Latter-day Saints living in Utah. Now, of course, people with the Y chromosome often have passed the Y chromosome along with the surname through the generation. So through an iterative comparison again, she was able to work out information that wasn't available in one data set by looking at the other data set and saying this surely applies to this person. And there were various kind of examples of this, of one very enterprising boy, for example, who was able to trace his father via via HapMap and a set of population records, postcode data. He was able to piece together and work out by kind of narrowing down who his father was. So I think he had the information from his mother on the surname, and the rest he did via data sets. So this was kind of all happening around the same time. And then the last one was that Jay what the argument of this paper was, the more you know about a population, however that is defined, the less easy it's going to be for a member of that population to withhold their data, because you can, given the right tools, the right expertise, the right combination of data sets, you can almost certainly infer their traits from knowing about the population that they're being part of. And we kind of respond to this. It wasn't published until 2011, it's on the web in 2010, but we respond to this with a group that I was working with in Oxford to kind of say again that this is very problematic because people think that when you tell them that data is confidential, it is confidential. So we're going to have to start to rethink this issue of privacy in the genomics era. But how am I doing for time? I'm gonna. This is really just 10 or 15. Okay, so I'm fine. So just to kind of summarise really what I've been seeing from this part of the talk is that reference populations are very important in the argument I'm making. I'm not suggesting for 1 minute that one data set is going to cause a problem. I'm talking about the fact that there are lots of data sets out there. And they're overlapping in their information. So you've also got now data sets from people like the name. I've forgotten the name. The people who do kind of online genetics testing, you can send off your samples. They send you back your kind of DNA. I've forgotten their name. No.
1, 2, 3.
23andMe, that's the further, right? So basically those sorts of actors are complicating the field even further, because they also have this sort of data. They're kind of linked up with Facebook, and people themselves are publishing this data. So, it's interesting because with genomic data, arguably, by letting information about a certain population out there, which you're part of, you're perhaps making some part of the decision for other members of your population about their confidentiality rights. But we can discuss that. So yes, this comparison between data sets can be done. It can be automated. There's data mining to look for particular relationships. This doesn't have to be done by one person with huge data sets. The imputation of missing and unavailable data has implications for what you can withhold. This is not necessarily new nor related only to genomics. Imputation is has a very long tradition in statistics, as people, especially in the UK, never want to tell you how much they earn. So they can work this sort of data out by looking at where they live, the kind of job they have. There is other data that, will give them clues about that missing data with a fairly good degree of accuracy. So as I say, there's the use of technology, discovering data mining tools, discovering relationships between traits, construction of group profiles, and the kind of, this idea of inference is, I've read in marketing journals, for example, but it could be in any sphere where this kind of process is used. It's reducing the chances of being wrong. So you're making a guess, but the more data you have, the better your kind of data mining tools, the less chance you're going to get that guess wrong. So we have a really strange problem, I think, and I think this is why we need to rethink all this, because it's bordering on two different problems. One is that you're put into a group, which arguably you could say is about discrimination. The other is that because people know with a great degree of certainty you're in that group, and they also know a lot about that group, they can work things out about you that you haven't told. So that's the privacy issue. So there are kind of two overlapping and very difficult to separate, but quite distinct ethical problems there. So I'm referring to this proposed legislation that I just talked about and the communication that's gone around. I'm talking about informed consent. Well, how does this affect consent? Well, as usual with consent, the idea is that a person knows to a good degree what their consent So we've got a real issue as data kind of circulates and is used, comes into all these different kind of combinations about consent, really. And I'm not going to talk a lot more about that because I don't have time. But there are real issues about consent raised by some of this problem, this related problem of consensuality. Okay, so consent versus context. As I kind of worked on the idea of, you know, data moving from the original context into other types of contexts where it's used. So the example for me is, as I said, data that is collected in a study by a particular cohort. For example, there's a cohort study in Bristol in the UK where people signed up when they were babies or their parents signed up when they were babies, and they're now about 21. And they basically, they've gone along through this cohort study all this time, and the people in the cohort used the data. They very much had control of the data. But this kind of context will change, or will at least be added to or extended by the fact that this data is now finding its way into a repository called UK 10K, which opens it up to a whole different set of actors. So I think I want to think a bit about how people kind of think about consent versus context, and I think this slide taps in a bit more to the role of the researcher, what the researcher kind of can do to protect people in the kind of, as the data moves, not into a completely open place, if you like, but in a sort of pathway, where a repository where people can apply for the data. So in consent, you ask, is the data anonymized? With context, you could ask, well, what do people think is going to happen? So, you know, you can tell people in consent, look, your data is anonymized, end of story, they've got that information, but what does that actually mean to people? What do they expect? So has informed consent been obtained? Do they have a signed piece of paper? Is it, in context, is it possible to predict the consequences either for the people collecting the data or the people giving the data? So what information has been provided from the people collecting the data to the people who are giving the data? So have we told them that it's going to be used by this and that person? And even that maybe there are going to be uses, as is more and more the case, that we can't necessarily tell them right now because it's going to be in a sort of repository where various actors can potentially use it for different things. Oops. So really, the context would take it then to, well, what expectations are people likely to have? What has been agreed to? So I'm more and more seeing that consent is being used as something of a divorce certificate. So it's true that you can say, look, I'm opening this data up to all these multiple uses, but we've got a consent in which we didn't specify that we were only going to work on this gene, or that we were only going to use this data in relation to this disease. And that's more and more the case because otherwise, down the line, people kind of run into problems where they have to go back to the consent and say, oh, look, they didn't consent to it, this is really going to be problematic for us. But as this consent becomes more and more kind of open, it also becomes less and less, to me, like consent. So do the users, so in a context where the data is given, do the users reflect the expectations that people might have? Okay, so thinking about two very clear contexts. One is the medical context. Another one is a financial context. Now, you would not, when you're in either of those contexts, I think that you would agree that you would not necessarily think that the data from a medical context would ever be or should ever be used in a kind of anything that could be thought of as financial. But as the circulation of data goes on, that isn't necessarily the case. So contexts where we kind of are embodied, giving our data in relation to a set of people and organisations, that still happens, but the data travels far beyond that context. So Nissenbaum has been really, really influential. She's a kind of legal philosopher based in America, and she talked about how the norms of distribution and display, define the context. So when you're, for example, you're in a medical situation, you probably think to some extent that, you could work out that it might be used for things that are not necessarily related to the problem you presented with that clinic, but perhaps other things that are related to your health. So that's the kind of, so you might think a doctor was talking to another doctor about something related to a problem you have or something like that. But not necessarily that that data is being used to kind of exclude you from insurance, for example, the practical example. And within any given context, you also have to think about, well, how much do people actually understand of what they've done by giving this information? Do they expect the consequences that happen? And well, again, in a sort of financial situation, you talk to a set of actors that you think they're going to do a certain set of things with that data because of the type of actors they are. So this is the context, this is the idea of a context, and this is why it informs people about what they think they're doing. This is why. So just to think, again, this is another dichotomy about the different models of access and what that kind of throws up. I mean, in the past, these kind of issues about use and further use have been negotiated by the scientists, by the people who potentially began a study and have a particular relationship with the data participants. And so further use of that is often being negotiated by the scientist who has kind of linked back to the original context, if you like. So arguably you could say, well, data sharing has always gone on, but the scientists who kind of originally collected it had some kind of control over that. And they perhaps have a better understanding of people's expectations or in that original context, if you like, than would a third-party, fourth-party, fifth-party user. So with the repository situation, you've got a one-off agreement where the data goes from its original context into a repository and it passes out of the kind of negotiating sphere of the original collecting scientists. The scientists are often working in network and knew each other, and of course you've got the problems of, people only wanting to work with their friends and all those sorts of things. I'm not making a judgment about that. But that's kind of how, the more traditional modes of collaboration and sharing data is done. Now they're going into repositories, so the data, it's not so much a network now as a one place, a one-stop where things can be reused. So the relationships, the kind of knowledge about the other people working in the field that was originally kind of informing decisions about sharing are replaced by formal applications and the kind of, you have to explain to the repository what you want to do with the data. So the context is gone and it's all about reuse. The control was in the hands of the collectors, now it's gone to the hands of the repositories. And this idea that I came up with when I was talking to scientists doing the empirical work for the biobanks kind of project I worked on in Oxford, where I talked to a lot of people who have biobanks. There was this idea that you looked at the research collecting the data had a responsibility to look after the data. And I'm not sure that in a kind of repository situation what replaces that exactly. I mean, obviously there are kind of formal rules about use, but that original relationship between the collector and the person who's giving information is obviously lost. So moving on quickly to open access. So basically, the Human Genome Project was very much a success for open access in that the Public Consortium won the race against Craig Venter. This was followed up by very important tactics such as the Walton Trust, encouraging individuals to share scientists who had collected data, often publicly funded research, to make these data available within the community of researchers. This kind of links into what the sociologist of science, Christine Hines, talks about as thrifty science. So it's about the maximisation of, there's a Spanish word for it, the maximisation of use of data that you've already collected. And this is an argument that Jenny, I've heard from Jenny, and this is quite often part of the kind of open data argument, is that we need to maximise the use of data that we've collected. I mean, and that idea has often been around because, you know, statistical data has been reused, and so this is not necessarily kind of revolutionary, but this is very much an argument about openness. And then we've just got lots more data, and you know, that this is also kind of having its effect, that we've got more data, we want more people to be able to get at it, to be able to process it, we need more people to kind of be able to do things with the data, because we've just got so much coming from new techniques and new technology, so whole genome sequencing on one hand, and new generation sequencing technologies on the other, which produces vast amounts of data quickly and more cheaply. So this was related to a paper that Master Anagni wrote in 2008, which I found very helpful, thinking about the problems of privacy and consent in relation to this. So this goes back to what I've been saying about individuals being discriminated against in relation to the particular characteristics they have, which can be found out not necessarily just by knowing that person, but also by knowing what the population of person is part of. The law continues, while this new proposed law is quite interesting, I'm going to say a bit more about it in relation to profiling now, but the definitions remain the same. It's really still about once you're anonymised, you're not really the individual so much anymore. And there's a lot of tension now between an increased recognition of problems of profiling, which when I first started talking about this a long time ago, it really was thought to be a non-issue. But it's increasingly being realised that yes, profiling does have ethical consequences, and they may well relate to goods that are traditionally related to privacy. And as Malcolm said, in genomics, the object is never really an individual. So you're always talking about groups. You know, that's the whole point of having all these things. You want to work out the effects within a population, and these effects are very, very small, but you need to know, well, what kind of population you're dealing with. You want to characterise that population very well. It's very, I mean, it might have applications to individuals such as personalised medicine, but genomics doesn't really deal with persons. And so, again, we come back to this problem of how to deal with problems of inference about groups, the relationship between a group and an individual in relation to protection of privacy using our traditional models. So, what I see is a movement in the right direction, because I think that we are starting to now realise that profile is a problem, okay? And, you know, the law, I've seen things like consultations in the UK where, you know, it's been increasingly said that, look, just because you've anonymised it, you know, you've got to think about the use of the disk as well, and the Information Commission looked at it last year that I looked at and wrote a comment on. And it was really starting to move towards this kind of idea that, look, you can't think about things in isolation, and you have to think about this relationship between groups. It's not enough. But we have this tension in that we still have the definitions of personal and anonymous. I mean, in relation to the kind of additional safeguards, this was already present in the 9546 directive. The idea that you can go somewhere, and because of the massive data that's been spread into the country, so potentially many levels of data, GIS, with postcode data, relating to potentially spending records and other information that's available freely from the National Statistics about a given area and the distribution of wealth in that area. You can have a computer basically make a decision about you using an algorithm or a threshold. And this is kind of trying, again, to address that this is not fair. You know, this is kind of, you can't say to a person, oh, the computer has said no. You have to, like, allow people to kind of, you know, to contest that and say, but why, you know? But that is very different. It relates a bit to the previous thing about the burden of proof. You have to know that that's happened in order to contest that. And when this kind of mixture of information is being used to make decisions, I argue that that is very difficult for an individual. So this, I'm getting very close to the end now. This is just to kind of think that this is like the idea I to do a whole a bunch of things, basically. And this can be done still by collaboration with project. It can also be done via open access. And basically it can be hypothesis driven, as in the old traditional model of data, or it can be data driven. So you can be looking at data, looking for the relationships between things. You don't even have to have a population in your mind to start with. You can create a population from a data driven type approach. And basically these things are related in a whole tangle of ways, and I argue it's extremely difficult for an individual to think about the context as a closed one when you have so many potential routes by which data can be used and can come into configurations with each other. And I think we need to kind of think now more and more about, well, how do we deal with those complexities? So, as I said, I don't think consent, while I don't think we should do away with consent, I don't think that we can necessarily, I think it's not necessarily ethical to think that because somebody has consented that their data can go beyond the original research context to wherever. I think it's increasingly difficult to actually say that is consent, because consent is about informing someone what will happen. And I think as increasingly as you use consent as a sort of door opener to allow the data to go further and further, then you're going to weaken what consent is. And I think that could have downstream problems about how people consider that their autonomy is being respected in research. Confidentiality similarly, and as I said, there are issues about thinking about a data set and how confidential it is and whether data is confidential or anonymous. I think classification of data as one thing, once and for all, is very difficult given the kind of the technologies, the actors, the motivations involved. I think that it really would depend on the kind of context. So I think that while context has been for me a very important concept in relation to privacy and how people think about privacy, I think we're actually moving even beyond that, because I think that context needs to be understood, and I think it's increasingly difficult to bound a context, to set boundaries once and for all to a context of information. And this has implications really about what people are able to understand, about the relationships they have with researchers. It has a whole bunch of implications. And so I think that what we should actually be thinking more about now is a set of assemblages, and this comes from the French word for arrangement, basically, where basically it's thought more and more that the context is very fluid, and what we need to think about is kind of temporary arrangements that people enter into, and then these might change, and we mustn't think about the context and the person consenting to that. I got, basically this was referring again to Mascar's building, and it was some kind of solutions that she thought of about dealing with kind of consent as you get to a more positive situation. But the problem, again, as we become more open, is that even these sorts of solutions may be problematic because the context is broken down. So I'm gonna basically